Welcome to Men's Leadership God's Way. I'm your host, Don Wood. This is the place where men learn to lead with faith, clarity, and conviction. Together, we'll explore real stories and biblical principles to help you be a model of integrity in your work, family, and everyday life. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome back to Men's Leadership God's Way. Now, today we're going to talk about something that changed everything for me in my life, and that's brotherhood. I'm not talking about acquaintances or the surface level friendships where everybody seems to smile, but no one tells the truth about each other. I'm talking about a sacred bond between men who know your story and they still stand beside you. Men who refuse to let you drown in silence. You know, when I started this podcast, I promised you honesty, not polish. And I'm going to open the curtain on a season of my life that nearly destroyed me and how God used one brother to save me. You know, for years, I lived by a false definition of strength. I thought strong guys kept everything inside. They never asked for help. And yet, the more pressure I felt, the harder I would clench my jaw and say, I'm good. But I wasn't. I was crumbling inside. You know, it started small. A couple drinks to take off the edge after a long day, then 3 and 4. And then pretty soon I couldn't get through the day without that burn in my throat. It dulled the noise for a while, but afterwards came the same familiar shame. I'd wake up and I'd whisper, God, I promise I'll stop tomorrow. But tomorrow always brought another reason to escape. You know, the thing about sin and self-reliance is that they build quiet prisons. No one else can see the bars, but you can feel them every morning when you open your eyes. And eventually for me, the walls closed in. My work suffered, relationships fell apart, and the mirror became my enemy. I'd stare back at me and think, you're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to lead. But all I saw was exhaustion and fear. When everything finally collapsed, I found myself sitting in a cold, silent jail cell surrounded by broken promises. It was quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat, and I'll tell you, it terrified me. And that's when I whispered a different kind of prayer. It wasn't polished, and it certainly didn't sound religious. It was just desperate. God, if you're still there, I need you. And you know what? He answered. Not with thunder and lightning, but with a knock on the jail cell door a few days later. I got released. And then I met this man I barely knew. He was kind of a friend of a friend, and he knew about my story. And he steps inside my house and he looks around and he said nothing for a long time. And then he said, Don, you don't have to fight this alone. For some reason, I can't explain it. Those words broke me because he didn't lecture me. He didn't pull out the Bible and quote scripture. He just hung out with me. And for the first time in years, I didn't have to pretend. So what happened was we started to meet once a week, and sometimes we'd talk and sometimes we would just hang out and watch a football game. He'd ask me how I was doing, and when I said fine, he'd smile and say, try again. I guess that's brotherhood. Someone who cares about you enough to see past the armor. And that relationship became the first spark of healing for me. It really did. He was proof that God's grace often shows up wearing human skin. And little by little, light started creeping into the places I had kept dark for years within me. And, you know, as months passed, I began to notice other guys around me, men where had been where I had been, leaders, fathers, husbands, and they were all exhausted and feeling isolated. You could see it in their eyes. I mean, they mastered that art of looking strong, but inside they were unraveling. But I could tell because I'd been there. And then one night after a long conversation with one of them, I felt God whispering to me again. You know what he said? Gather them. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm still learning to walk this straight walk by myself. But God said, gather them and show them what I'm showing you. So I did. I invited a handful of guys. There was no program. There wasn't any agenda. There wasn't any kind of promotion. It was just a simple message. Let's hang out. Let's be honest and let's see what God does. And I was really surprised because 7 said yes. And that's where the real miracle began. I remember that first night we're all hanging out and there was just like this weird, awkward silence. It's that energy where you're in the room full of people and you feel like no one wants to go first. So we're joking about sports and jobs and all this small talk, everything but ourselves. And then finally I said, look, I'll go first. And then I told them my story, the drinking, the jail, and then how God had found me. And when I finished with the whole story, the room was dead quiet. Then this guy named Mark became a good friend of mine. He says, Don, my marriage is hanging by a thread because my wife is just so tired of me pretending that everything's fine. And that one little confession it was awesome. That one little confession broke open the dam because another guy says, I'm empty. Everyone thinks I've got it together, but I feel dead inside. I feel like my life's over. Another guy says, I drink a hell of a lot more than I should. Another one said that I haven't talked to my family and had an honest conversation with them in months. And you know what I realized? God was there. There's no spotlight or a sermon. There's just truth in a circle of guys who finally removed their masks. And from that night on, not one of them ever hid again. So we met every week. And unless someone had to travel, nobody missed. And, they didn't come for advice. They just wanted honesty. And over the next few months, I watched all of these walls start to collapse. And I saw men go from being strangers to brothers. And when one would stumble, the other guys would lift him up. And when one guy would celebrate, we all celebrated. When one confessed, everyone listened without judgment. And that circle became sacred ground for us. A few months in, one guy showed up. He was late. You could tell he was crying. He was really upset. And he said, I need to say something before I lose my nerve. And he said, I'm done pretending. My wife says she doesn't know me anymore, and she's right. And he started to cry right in front of us. And without hesitation, one of the guys reached over and put a hand on his shoulder, and another one said, You're not alone, brother. And Jason said, I didn't know men could be this honest. And that's when true healing started for him. A few weeks later, Dave, our quietest member, spoke up. He says, I've been addicted to porn since I was 16. I've prayed, I've deleted everything, and I've promised God 100 times, but I always go back and I'm sick and tired of lying. He was bracing for a rejection. Instead, he had a consensus because we all knew where he was coming from. And this guy said, This is the first time I've ever believed I could really be accepted in a group of guys. Then there was this guy named Tom. He was so steady. He had this countenance of like this easy Sunday afternoon. One night he comes in and he's pale. He's quiet. He says, My son won't talk to me. It's been 2 years. I've tried everything and yet he still hates me. One of the guys said, Tom, listen, you've carried us along when we couldn't even stand. So let's carry you now. And so we prayed over him. No like speeches, just men lifting a brother up. And then 3 months later, he walks in and he's smiling. He says, My son called and we're going to have dinner next week. And we were so happy for that guy. But you see, this is what brotherhood does. It heals what isolation breaks. And it kept happening. Story after story of redemption in this group. One man broke free of addiction. Another guy reconciled with his wife. Another started leading a group of his own. And this ripple effect just kept growing. It was unbelievable. And then I learned something. that brotherhood isn't an event, it's a lifestyle. It's guys who come together, who decide to stop performing and start telling the truth. Maybe you're listening right now and you're thinking, well, this sounds great, Don, but I don't have men like that. I get it. I really do. You could have hundreds of contacts and still have zero brotherhood. But you know what? It doesn't have to stay that way. Find one guy who wants to grow. Start meeting. Keep it small. Hang out. Be real. Regular conversation. No masks. No judgment. Do that long enough, and I'm going to promise you God will show up. Because in my experience, the strongest guys I know aren't the loudest. They're the ones who are humble enough to say, I can't do this alone. And guys, that's where true courage begins. And if you're listening right now and there's something in your chest, it's tightening a bit, that's not guilt. You know what that is? That's recognition. It's the spirit nudging you, saying, this is what you've been missing. Because I'll be honest, after years of leading these groups, I've realized the single greatest tragedy among men today isn't failure, it's isolation. We've built lives that are just full of activity, but empty of connection. We scroll, we post, we perform, we look strong, but inside, we're starving for someone to just look at us and say, I still believe in you. You know what we do? We hesitate. It's because we've been hurt, because somewhere along the line, someone betrayed your trust or laughed when you opened up. So we promise ourselves never again. But you know what? That vow that we put on, that armor, you know what happens? It transforms into a prison. And one day you're going to wake up and realize you've surrounded yourself with people, but no one really knows you. Men tell me that all the time. Don, I've got friends. And I'll ask, okay, which one of them knows what you're really struggling with? And every single time I get silence. You see, friendship isn't built on comfort. It's built on a superficial association, I'd like to say. It's a way of life where it's filling in the gaps, but there's no real substance there. But brotherhood is built on truth. Truth is what sets men free. But you can't tell the truth in a room where everybody's pretending. Can't. I remember one night after the group, I sat alone in that room that we always met in, and the chairs were still in a circle, and I could smell the the faint mix of coffee, and there was proof that life had happened in there. But then I thought, this is what church was supposed to feel like. There's no stage or spotlight, just honest men being changed. And that's when I prayed something dangerous. I said, God, do this again everywhere. And then God says to me, well, then teach them how. So I started to train men to lead circles of their own. And I told them, don't try to be a teacher, be a brother. And the Holy Spirit will handle everything else. And then soon, little groups started forming in other towns. 4 here, 5 there, 10 here and there. And then I realized the stories started pouring in. One guy, he calls me and he says, we've only met 4 times and already my son says that he sees a different dad. Another guy said, for the first time in 20 years, I told my wife I was scared. And you know what? She said, I knew that. That's the ripple effect of brotherhood. It moves from feeling like you're turning your life around. And as a result, you're influencing others. It turns broken men into leaders. And then leaders become healers. But to keep that alive, you have to keep feeding it. You have to keep developing a bunch of other circles because brotherhood doesn't survive on good intentions. It requires consistency. That's when you show up when you don't feel like it. You tell the truth when it's uncomfortable. You listen when you'd rather talk. And you even pray when words don't even come easy. But every time you do, another link of strength forms. So there was one night that's still etched in my memory. We had a guy named Aaron, big guy, construction worker, tough as nails, never said much. But one evening, right before we wrapped up, he said, "Can I tell you something weird?" He says, "I've been angry my whole life. I've been pissed at my dad, at God, even myself. But tonight, I think I finally forgave him." And we're sitting there just stunned. We didn't say a word. And then, honest to goodness, tears start running down his face. And you could tell what was releasing was decades of pain. And all he said was, "I feel lighter." And because that happened that night, we all felt lighter because when one man gets free, the whole room rises with him. And that's why brotherhood matters, guys. You can't heal alone, you can't grow alone, and you can't lead alone. Even Jesus didn't walk alone. He surrounded himself with 12 men. They weren't perfect, but they were willing, and he called them brothers. When I think about the life of Jesus with his disciples, I see laughter and correction and forgiveness. They're sharing meals together. They're hanging out and doing life together. And that's brotherhood in its purest form. It was divine with Jesus, but it was also deeply human. Hey guys, do you ever feel like you're leading on the outside but running empty on the inside? Hi, I'm Don Wood, founder of Men's Leadership God's Way. I work one-on-one with executives and leaders who are ready to trade burnout, confusion, and isolation for clarity, confidence, and peace. My coaching is designed to help you to lead with conviction without sacrificing your health, faith, or family. So if you're ready to experience the transformation you've been searching for, visit mensleadershipgodsway.com and let's start your journey today. So what I want to do right now is just shift gears for a minute because I know some of you listening lead teams, companies, and ministries, and you're carrying responsibilities that don't stop when the sun goes down. You're good at fixing things. You plan and you solve, but somewhere along the way, you stop being known. Now, I've coached enough leaders to know this. The higher you climb, the lonelier it gets. The applause gets louder, but the conversations get quieter. People start talking to your position, not to your heart. So what happens is you start building a wall. And that wall actually will keep you safe for a while until it starts keeping you a prisoner. Now, you can have success without brotherhood, but you can't have peace without it. Because here's what will happen. You're going to burn out, lash out, or fade out. I've seen all three. And if that's you, I want you to listen to me. God is not asking you to give up your leadership. He's asking you to share it, to let others see behind the curtain, to stop carrying everything alone. And when you invite other men into your battles, believe me, you're not a burden to them. You're actually blessing them. You're giving them permission to fight in their own battle as well. And I want you to be sure about this. Brotherhood isn't just about accountability, it's about belonging. It's hearing another guy say, "I'm in this too." And you realize you're not defective, you're a human. When I sit with men in my groups, I often say this line: confession is the doorway to connection. Let me say that again. Confession is the doorway to connection. And every time someone walks through it, freedom rushes in. There's power in speaking truth. And as long as sin and shame stay silent, they're going to rule in your life. But the moment they're named in front of brothers who love you, it loses authority. Maybe that's what some of you need this week, to say something out loud, to look a friend in the eye and admit, "You know what? I'm struggling." And it's not because you want pity, it's because you want freedom. I've never once met a man who got destroyed by honesty, but I've met a lot of guys whose lives they caved in because of secrecy. Now, before we move deeper, I want you to imagine something. Imagine what would happen if men everywhere decided to live this way, openly, courageously, and in brotherhood. What would that do to our families, to your kids that are watching you, to the next generation of men who think that strength means silence? You know what, guys? It would change everything. And it's time we redefine strength, not by standing alone, but being together. And that's where true revival begins, in the hearts of guys who stop hiding. So we're going to go even deeper here to talk about how to build this in your own life, how to find your circle, and how to keep it alive even when it gets messy. But before we do, I want you to ask Jesus something quietly right here, right now. Lord, who do you want me to walk with? Don't rush the answer. A face or a name might come to mind. Write it down. This might be the beginning of your own brotherhood story, because you can't build brotherhood by accident. It takes intention. So let me walk you through what I've learned, the practices that make brotherhood real, not theoretically. And here's the first thing: start small. You know, a lot of times when guys hear community, they think crowds. But in my experience, depth only happens in circles small enough where no one can hide. 10 was my number. I maxed out at 10 guys. And I want you to find your own 10. And then set the tone early. From the very first meeting, tell them this isn't about fixing each other, it's about walking together. And that one sentence will change everything. And then guard the space. Confidentiality is sacred. Always say whatever is said here stays here. Because if a man risks his heart and then later hears his story repeated somewhere at the store, I'm telling you, trust will die. So there's no gossip and there's no joking about someone else's pain. And when you protect the circle, men learn it's safe to express their true hearts in that circle. And then stay consistent. You know, men will show up for what matters, because when you skip a week, the momentum will fade. But when you keep showing up, even when you're tired, something supernatural will happen. Reliability turns into healing. And then finally, commit to pray together. Keep it simple. I mean, just you can say something like, Lord, help us be men of truth. Help us love our families well. And that's enough. I'll tell you, God honors honest words more than eloquent ones. Now, I want to tell you a story about this guy named Chris. He was a businessman. He's sharp. He's respected, mid 40s, always walked around in the group looking composed. And for weeks, barely said a word. And then one night, after another guy shared about losing his temper with his kids, all of a sudden he leans forward and said, I did something last week I can't even forgive myself for. And he told us about shouting at his teenage daughter until she cried. And then he said, when she looked at me, I saw fear. My own daughter was afraid of me. Then the room gets quiet, and you can tell he's waiting for the judgment. Instead, he says, brother, we've all been there. Call her tonight. Don't wait. Another guy said, you can rebuild that. Start with, I'm sorry. I've thought a lot about it, and here are the things that I'm going to do to be sure it doesn't happen again. Then next week, he comes back smiling. He says, I called her. I apologized. She cried and she hugs me. And she added, she told me that she's proud of me for going to this group. Guys, that is the power of being honest. One confession can rewrite the story of a life. And over time, something else started happening in our groups. Men began to own their purpose. They realized God didn't call them to survive, He called them to be leaders in their families, careers, and communities. And leadership wasn't about control. It was about being an example. And I always say to the guys, whether you realize it or not, everyone's watching. People don't listen to what you say, they watch what you do. When one man will stand in authenticity, it gives the others permission to follow suit. And that's how movements start. They're quiet. They start in living rooms before they ever hit the stages. So if you're leading right now, whether it's in business or in your ministry at your home, this is for you because people don't need your perfection. They need your presence. They need to see what grace looks like under pressure. They need to see a man who admits when he's wrong and still stands tall because his worth isn't built on applause. Brotherhood doesn't happen by accident. It starts with honesty. And maybe today's episode stirred something in you, a reminder of a friendship that maybe you've neglected or a hunger for connection you've been too busy to notice. Guys, don't brush it off. Reach out to that one man this week and start the conversation. That's how brotherhood begins. Now, in part 2, we're going to go even deeper. We're going to talk about what real brotherhood requires: consistency, courage, and the kind of accountability that helps you grow stronger than you could ever do alone. Until then, stay real, grounded, and remember, you were never meant to do this alone. Hey guys, thanks for spending time with me today on Men's Leadership God's Way. I hope this episode gave you encouragement and practical wisdom you can use right away. And if you would, please take a quick moment to rate and review the show on Apple or Spotify. Your support helps more men discover how to lead with awareness, courage, and confidence. And if you're ready to take the next step in your leadership journey, you can learn more about my coaching services and resources at mensleadershipgodsway.com. Until next time, demonstrate optimism and possibility wherever you go.